Welcome to Critical Issues Commentary, the radio ministry of Twin City Fellowship, a non-denominational Christian church in Minneapolis. We're on the web at www.cicministry.org. This is Todd Kramasz, your host for the next half hour. I'm filling in for the vacationing Dick Kuffel. And once again, it's our pleasure to speak with Bob DeWaay, pastor of Twin City Fellowship and author of Critical Issues Commentary. Well, Pastor Bob, today's topic, part two of something we discussed and started earlier, global warming, blind faith, and global delusion. A book review of Taken by Storm, the Troubled Science, Policy, and Politics of Global Warming.
Yes, and if someone wants to get this book, I just go to Amazon.com and search for it.
Authors Christopher Essex, Ross McKittrick, two Canadian professors.
Yes, and we were talking last week about the politics of this and the pagan worldview that drives it. The ideas that humans, just by living and breathing and going about normal life, are the big threat to the world that we live in.
Right. And if I recall, you made me feel bad about myself for producing all of this.
Yeah.
It was utility. But I've since forgiven you. We can go on now.
Okay, good, Todd.
Sure. Now, what we wanted to talk about, T-Rex. Sounds like a horrible thing, Bob. A monster. What is it? What is
well,
T-Rex?
that's the book that we're reviewing, by the way, uses some tongue-in-cheek and sarcasm. I love the book. Okay, T-Rex is a term they made up.
Okay.
In fact, they have a chapter entitled "T-Rex Devours the Planet."
Ooh.
So they start talking about, is there such a thing as a temperature of the Earth that could be taken and given in a single number?
Similar to a human being, 98.6. That's the temperature of a human being.
Yeah. So they talk about that. And they said that that is a myth because you cannot have a temperature of a system unless the system is in thermodynamic equilibrium.
What does that mean to us non-scientists?
Well, that means that within the system, there is no exchanges of temperature within it. It's all the same. Okay. There's no process going on whereby in one place within the system it has a certain temperature, and another place it has a different one, and those are changing.
Mm-hmm.
So equilibrium means you're thermodynamically at equilibrium. You take the temperature, it's going to be the same throughout the system you're looking at.
All right.
Okay. And they pointed out you don't have that in a room. You can't. There isn't really a temperature in a room, okay? Because you can go, and anybody would know this if you sat in any type of a room, that it might be warm in one spot, cooler in another. They said you can't take a glass of ice water and set it on in front of a fireplace, take the temperature of the ice water, take the temperature of the fireplace, average the two, and say, here's the average temperature.
That would be rather sloppy,
Well,
wouldn't you?
it wouldn't mean anything. It'd be meaningless.
Right.
The temperature in the glass of ice water is one thing. The one in the fireplace is another.
Apples and oranges is what you're saying.
Yeah, and then if you took the temperature in that room 20 feet away, that'd be another matter altogether. So even in a given room, you do not have thermodynamic equilibrium. You have many temperatures, not a temperature. Okay, so you may have a thermometer on the wall that gives you an approximation of what's like in the room.
Right.
But even that isn't perfectly accurate. Have you ever sat under a draft or what have you? So what they're pointing out is that taking so many thousand temperatures here and there around the planet and averaging them together isn't really giving you a meaningful figure.
They've been doing that since when? The 30s?
Well, the temperatures have been tracked for longer than that, but see, these statistics aren't a temperature. Let's just give an example. We live here in the Minneapolis area, okay? So they have the temperature at the airport. Now, if they were taking the temperature at the airport every day and every night for 20 years, which I assume they have been.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And you could say this. Over those 20 years, on July 9th, the average was this. Okay? So that average, whatever it was, let's say the average high was 82 or whatever. What you have is not a temperature that was taken, it's a statistic. It's a statistic that says this is kind of what it's like in Minnesota. That may not have been actually 82 for a high even once during those 20 years.
Right.
It might have been 95 and 72 and this and that and this and that. It's a meaningful statistic for us living here, because as long as the data collection was at the same place under the same conditions, it's at least meaningful about what it's like, and you can even see a trend whether it was up or down,
right,
if you went over enough data. Now, here's something that most people don't know, that back in the 60s and 70s, there were something like, here it is, I'm going to just quote from my article here, the Global Historical Climatological Network that gathers data from stations that record local temperatures had between 12,000 and 15,000 locations from which to gain data between 1950 and 1970. Now, you need to remember, by the way, that most of these are in North America or Europe or in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the world, nobody's even taking the temperature or and preserving it over years.
Right. Why would they? It's what they would.
Yeah, you could go to a third world country and they don't know what the average was in their village. There's nobody taking the temperature and preserving it in documents and records.
So 15,000 locations between 1950 and 1970.
Yes.
Well,
In 2000, there were less than 6,000 of those. We have less than half the data than we had even 20 years ago.
We're reading less than half of the data we were 20 years ago.
Right.
And we're making these pronouncements and all sorts of
based on less data that's not even from the same locations, and much more of the data is from urban areas with the heat island effect.
Right.
Okay?
A city will hold heat in the winter and in the summer.
And so the temperatures at airports is kind of what's left after so many of the remote places have closed down.
Sure.
People aren't taking the data and recording the data, so we have less data to work with.
Well, these numbers you just read, I mean, it might lead a reasoning critical thinker to say, well, that's enough to know right there that something is up, something's amiss.
Exactly.
This global warming business.
Right, but nobody's telling you that. I suggest you read these guys' book. Now, they call this temperature. Now, we don't have a global temperature. We only have statistics.
Mm-hmm.
And the statistics are taken just from certain places, not everywhere on the globe, obviously. So this global temperature, which is a false entity that they call T-Rex, tongue-in-cheek. They call it T-Rex. It's the big T-Rex dinosaur that's going to devour the planet. And so we have data from airports and large cities, less data than we've had before. And in any situation like this, you have to terminate your process and start over if you have different data gathering methodology. Okay? You're not comparing apples to apples anymore.
No.
You can't compare the data that was gathered in 1950 from 15,000 locations to data gathered in 2007 from 6,000 locations.
Less than that even.
Yeah, and in different locations than they were before. Mm-hmm. So once the process changed, the study has to change. You have to start a different thing. But they don't do that. They take data that wasn't even taken from temperatures, the study of tree rings, coring into the ocean floor, getting ice core samples.
From glaciers.
Yeah, and so they take all this data gathered in totally different ways to get numbers for hundreds of years ago where they actually weren't even taking temperatures necessarily, and then tacking it on the data gathered in some other way and creating this big chart and saying, see, here it is, global warming. And these guys say, this is absolutely unacceptable. This isn't even meaningful.
These two authors are responsible professors and scientists.
Well, you have to be able to think critically. You mentioned that a little bit earlier, Todd.
It's the most important.
Absolutely. These guys aren't right because they're too experts any more than the policymakers for the United Nations that are paid to come up with this official science are right because they're the experts. As a matter of fact, as we saw on that DVD we talked about last week,
right,
there are thousands of people that could be asked about this, and at least half of them don't believe that we know that there's any global warming going to happen in the future or whether it's even happening now. Okay? But I've read a book written by two guys, what makes them right and everybody else wrong. How can I decide that? Well, I'll tell you how I decided it based on critical thinking about what is rational and what makes sense. I didn't read just one side of it. I read Al Gore's book in careful detail, Earth in a Balance. And reading it, I could see what's wrong with it by using critical thinking. What did I see was wrong? Well, his claim that all reality is like a